In this demonstration, I want to talk a little bit about using some selection tools. First thing is, let's look at the file that we're using. If you're using the Classroom in a Book for CS6, it will come with your tutorial files in the Lesson 3 folder, and it's called 03start.psd. So go ahead and open that file. If you don't have that file, then follow along with the basic principles. So the first thing I want to say about this is a little bit of a disclaimer. This file is made so that the selections are very simple to actually achieve successfully. So with that being understood, typically selections are not this easy to make in real pictures that are not just of a bunch of perfectly, cropped out and already masked product shots, and things that look like product shots or scanned images and so forth. They might be this simple, for instance, if you were to lay an object down on a scanning bed and you scan it against a white background, but for the most part, real photographs are not this simple to make selections. So with that being said, you really need to understand this as just a practice file that helps you get a little bit familiar with how the tools work before you get into more complex stuff later. Okay, so let's get started. First tool I want to talk about is this tool right here. It's called the Quick Selection tool. And if you click and hold, you'll see underneath it is the Magic Wand tool. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But right now, I just want to show you the Quick Selection tool. It is really one of the easiest tools to use in Photoshop. And it does a pretty good job of finding the borders of the things that you want to select. In this file, it's going to be incredibly simple because we basically have really different tolerances where we've got this stark white background with a clear definition of all these other colored pixels. So the selection tool really doesn't have to fight that hard to understand what it is that you want to select. It will be more challenging in other pictures for the most part. So if you want to start to get an idea, you could select the Quick Selection, and you notice that the options up here change. There's some different options, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click, and I just dragged a little bit, and you see that it automatically just selected the sand dollar because it's so different from the white background. But you could also see, if you wanted to test with something different, that it starts to do the same thing with the shell, but it grabs a little bit extra because some of the tolerances of the pixels are a little bit different. So there are some different ways that you can deal with that. And also notice that whenever I clicked and I selected the sand dollar and then I clicked over here on the shell, unlike some of the other selection tools, which you'll discover later, is that instead of deselecting the sand dollar when I clicked on the shell, it added to the selection. And the reason for that is that up here in the options panel, you've got this little plus symbol that's selected, and that means that it's going to automatically add to the selection every time I click on something new. So if I were to click on, for instance, this plate, okay, then it's going to add, now I've got 3 things selected. So if I want to deselect all of those, you can go ahead and do the key command, which is Command D or Control D. Okay, if you don't want the behavior where it automatically adds, if you want to subtract something, you can just click on the minus symbol, and then it's only going to subtract out anything that's already selected, which is what I'm doing here. Okay, so you can use these tools up here, the plus and the minus, to easily be able to add to your selections and subtract from your selections. Another thing that you can do also is, here, let's go ahead and click on this again. Alright, I want to show you what I did. As I clicked on this button up here on the left, the one that's neither addition nor subtraction, if I hold down the Option key or the Alt key and I click and I drag in a place that's already selected, what it's doing is it's going to subtract from the selection. Anytime in Photoshop and you're using selections, if you hold down the Alt or Option key, it's going to subtract from the selection, but if you hold down the Shift key, like I'm doing now, and I click and I drag, it will add to the selection. Okay, so that's something that's really useful to understand. I'm going to deselect everything by saying Command D or Control D. So that's a really brief thing about the Quick Selection tool, and you'll see that in this demonstration There are a lot of things you could actually use the selection tool for, or the quick selection for. For instance, this, even though the book is going to try to get you to use something different, that one's pretty fast. So just remember, one of the reasons, however, is because the dramatic difference between the stark white background and all of these colored pixels is really easy for the quick selection tool to just grab them. Now I'm going to deselect. So let's go back to the shell when we were talking about it earlier. If I go ahead and start to make a selection, and you see that it starts to grab all these pixels down here. Well, if I want, I can go ahead and I can select my subtraction tool here, and I can start down in the corner and start to eliminate some of those pixels. And I'm just drawing it while I'm clicking and dragging, trying to be careful not to get too close to the edge of the shell, and then it'll automatically kind of do the work for me. And I'm sort of just erasing, in a way, if you want to think of it that way, portions of my existing selection. And if you can't, something else that I want to make a note of is that right now I don't really have this blown up very much. If you want to be able to see what you're doing a lot better, it's always a good idea to kind of blow things up a little bit so that you can see the edges and see how good the selections are that you're actually making, because sometimes the selections that you make are really not that great. And so if I wanted to get rid of some of these things, I could get rid of them really quickly. And don't worry about dipping in right here. We can always go back later and correct some of that. Okay, but let's get rid of some of these things. And you see that a lot of these edges are being corrected as I go through systematically and remove the pixels around the corners, or excuse me, around the edges. And see, I've removed a little much there. Now, one of the things I can do to fix this edge here and this edge here is I can go up to where it says Refine Edge in the Options panel, click on that, and you see that it automatically starts to drop everything else away. Now, it's not really permanently dropped away, but you can also see that I can do something else to start to refine the edges now. While I've got this tool selected in my Refine Edges panel, I can come in here and I can start to kind of pull those edges back in a little bit by painting them in. Alright, and I'm just kind of clicking and dragging, and I might have grabbed a little bit much, but you see it kind of corrected it for me right there. And so you can kind of adjust it this way. Another thing that you can do is you can start to smooth the edges if it looks really jaggedy, and you can start to shift the edge in a little bit or shift the edge out. And so we can adjust that, and you can see that it's eating away a little too much of the selection. So you can adjust a lot of these things and see how it affects everything. Alright, and if you adjust the radius also, you can see what happens with the colors, and it starts to adjust it so that it really refines your selection for you. So that's another little tool that you can use as well. Okay, and then you can just go ahead and commit to it, and you can say OK. And what that does is it's going to create a selection. Now, if I wanted to remember this selection, and I might be jumping around, by the way, a little bit if you're following from the book, but there's some things I think are just useful to tell you in a different order. Okay, so now that I've gotten this nice selection, what I might want to do so I don't lose it, let's say I'm not ready to actually do anything with this just yet, I could go up here and I can go to Select, and then I can go to Save Selection, and let's call it Shell. And I'm going to save it as a new channel, okay, and then I'm going to save it in this document as a new channel, hit OK. And now let's say that I deselect it so I can do something else, okay. Well, if I want to reselect it, I don't have to go through that selection process again. I can just go up to Select, and I can say Load Selection. And then I can choose the shell channel. Okay, and I can click on OK, and automatically see it's there. Now what's important is that it's always going to load that selection right there in that spot. So if you were to take this set of pixels, including the shell and its background, and move it somewhere, and then reload the selection would not be on top of the shell any longer. It would still load it right here. So that's something to remember. And if we want to actually follow what the book is doing, then we'll scoot over here and we'll go ahead and take our quick selection tool. we're going to select our sand dollar, and what it tells you to do is to go ahead and move it onto the plate. So I'm going to go ahead and take my move tool, which is at the very top up here. It's this little pointy arrow, and we can actually go ahead and we can move it to another place right here, let's say, onto this plate. And I want you also to notice something else though. See the little showing a little bounding box? If I drop it, the bounding box goes away. So don't be confused. If you are clicking and dragging and you see a bounding box, don't think that those are some unselected pixels. It's actually just going to be the bounding box showing you about how large your selection is. Now let's say that I like where this is located, and I want you to notice what happens whenever I move it outside just by using regular move. You see that it's actually, what it's done is it's cut out a hole here, and it's literally moved the pixels. It's cut the pixels and moved them. It's not, and it leaves like whatever is the background image. And right now if you look down in the bottom of the toolbar, you see that we have black set as the background image. So it shows the black background in the back. Well, if you didn't want that to happen, if you wanted to make a copy of it over there so that you have the original sand dollar down here, then what you would have to do is something a little bit different. You would have to hold down the Option or the Alt key before you had tried to move it, and it would duplicate it. But we're okay with it the way it is right now. And I want you to also notice something, is that in the layer panel, or layers panel, we still just have one layer. So once I drop this and leave this, that's where the new picture is going to be. So there's some disadvantages of that, but if we're just working with simple basic selections and moving them around and so forth, then it's not that big of a deal. But if we really cared about having this sand dollar in an independent layer, we would do something a little bit differently. So what I did was I just deselected, and I wanted to show you something. Now I can't, if I were to go back and make that selection again using the quick selection tool, okay, first of all, you see that it's harder to make the selection because now it's not on pure white. But if I wanted to go ahead and take my subtraction tool, I could subtract a little bit of this, and I could subtract some more, and you see it becomes a little bit harder to use that selection tool. But just to show you what could happen, let's take that move tool again and move it, and it cuts, now it's cut out this hole from here because we're in a single flattened layer. That's what I wanted to show you. So I'm going to go down to my history. I have my history open. If you don't, you can go up to Window and then find your history panel, okay, to show it. And I actually want to go back a little bit, and so let's go back all the way to where I said deselect, and let's go back one more. Alright, and I can scroll up a little bit, and I still have my selection. And let's say, for instance, that we really don't like having it just, you know, overriding different pixels on this layer right here of the plate. Let's say we don't want to move over there and then lose those parts of the plate pixels. Well, let's go back, and let's just keep going back until we get to this part of the selection. Okay, and then what I can do instead of cutting this out is that I can actually go up to Edit, and I can say Copy It. And then I want to show you, if I do a paste, what's going to happen. So if I go to Edit and then I say Paste, it created a new layer over here with the sand dollar on top of it, and it created a copy of that sand dollar right here in the exact same place right on top of it. So now, while this layer is selected, layer 1, while this layer is selected, if I take my move tool and I move it, you can see that now I have a completely independent layer that I can turn off or on, and it doesn't denigrate the pixels that are underneath it whenever I move it onto that plate. Okay, this isn't something necessarily that the book goes into right away, but I want to show you this right up front because I think it's a really important and useful thing to understand how layers work right off the bat. Okay, so in fact I can even go over to my layer and I can double click it and I can call it sand dollar. Okay. That is going to do it for right now about the